everybody. Welcome back. Psychedelics. Today, we are joined by Professor Kempner of Rutgers. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you? And thanks for having me.
Absolutely huge fan of your recent book, so I'm excited to chat about it. Recent book's titled Psychedelic Outlaws. I don't know the subtitle. What's the subtitle?
It is I don't always remember it. The Movement Revolutionizing Modern Medicine.
Mm.
I
And
think.
I think. And it's out on Hachette, is that right?
Hachette Books published it, and it is for purchase. You can purchase it just about anywhere.
Lovely. I've been talking it up quite a bit because you profile ClusterBusters in a pretty serious way, and it's an organization I've been aware of for a really long time, and tragically, they've not really had all that much attention in the psychedelic space. All the psychotherapy stuff seems to take up the air in the room, and which is, perhaps appropriate, but with my work with Court Wing, Psychedelics and Pain Association, things like that, we're really trying to expand the scope of what we talk about around psychedelics, because it's a little boring when we only talk about one thing. So let's talk about a bunch of things.
Well, I appreciate that. Pain is also such an extraordinary problem, especially if you've experienced pain. You might know this, and intersects. It's an issue that intersects with both mental health and addiction. The other thing that I've always found quite puzzling about the lack of discussion about ClusterBusters is that they've been at this for so long. They've been really part of the psychedelic movement for almost 25 years now.
Yeah, I think I was hanging out at my mentor's house in Vermont reading through some journals, and it was really early data where they were doing kind of comparisons to oxygen, to psilocybin and LSD, I think, and that might have been one of the earlier papers they published, perhaps. Do you recall like studies along those lines where they were doing kind of comparative approaches to psychedelics and oxygen?
I don't.
No,
Well,
it's all good.
It's an interesting question because oxygen and psychedelics are used in a little bit of a different way for treating cluster headache and for cluster headache,
sure.
yeah. So
your chapters covering that were harrowing, by the way. So thanks for doing that so well.
but I can see, but there are patient-led surveys, medication use surveys that include oxygen and psychedelics, so you can see the kind of comparative effectiveness.
So how did this topic come on your radar? And let's talk. Well, actually, before we do that, what kind of stuff do you study, and what do you do over there at Rutgers?
So I'm a sociologist of science and medicine and inequality. I often kind of think of myself as a feminist science studies scholar. So I'm really interested in, kind of how the sausage gets made in medicine and science and in biomedicine. When I started doing research in medicine, I got really interested in migraine, not psychedelics, but in migraine, kind of because I have chronic migraine. And, a lot of times we get interested in the things that we have. So I started doing that work probably in 2001 when I was a graduate student. And one of the things that really struck me was I wanted to figure out why things that are really important, things that really affect people as problems, don't get any attention, don't get any resources, that people don't care about. And people in pain know this really well, right? People with chronic disabilities, they really understand places where medicine doesn't know enough. It's can kind of be difficult to study absence and ignorance in science and medicine, which is essentially what really I was intellectually interested in. So migraine became a really kind of important portal for me into that area. And so I wrote a book about that. Why is this disease that's like just affects so many people? Why do people, why is it so hard to get a diagnosis? Why is it so hard to get treatment? And while I was doing that work, that's when I learned about cluster headache, which is such an interesting disease that so few people know about. And then while I was doing that work, that was during the George W. Bush administration, and I was kind of really also interested in these other areas of political suppression of science, around climate change, around sex research, places where the government was coming in and intervening and trying to keep people from knowing really important topics. So psychedelics kind of was a natural fit for me. It was a topic I cared about, and there was a prohibition, and there was a movement of people who wanted to know more in that area, and so yeah, that's sort of how I got here.
Bush. Yeah, my like immediate first thing was like depleted uranium, but we don't have to go there. But can you describe a little bit about like the difference between migraines and clusters?
Yeah, so most people are going to be familiar with migraine. It affects
Yeah.
about 40 million people. So put that in perspective. That's like that's more than the population of California. It's a lot of people have migraine. Cluster headache is pretty rare. About 300,000 Americans have cluster headache. But they're both headache disorders. They're both primary headache disorders, which means that they're not like a symptom of a brain tumor or some other cause. They're both really painful, for sure. But they're painful in really different ways. So, like I said, I have chronic migraine. And chronic migraine is really disabling. It's really demoralizing. It's really depressing. Cluster headache is extraordinarily painful. It is often considered the most severe pain a human can experience. More painful than unmedicated labor, more painful than a gunshot wound. So painful that something like 70% of people who are experiencing a cycle of cluster headache experience suicidal ideation at the same time. And that kind of ideation is really focused on getting rid of the pain. And, I have a lifetime of migraine, and it's never actually, maybe metaphorically, maybe want to kill myself, but nothing like this. Cluster headache is a much shorter lasting headache, 15 to 180 minutes per attack. And those attacks come and go, sometimes multiple times per day. And they happen in clusters of time. Perhaps they come on for a week to several months, and then people go into a remission, which is different than migraine, which, people can get, once a month for a long time. Or if you have chronic migraine like me, you may be having headaches, more than half the days of a month. They kind of have very different manifestations. The other thing that is interesting about cluster headache is the autonomic symptoms. So if you have migraine, you might have phono. I can't say it. Light or sound sensitivity, right? So light and sound bothers you. You might feel nauseous, things like that. With cluster headache, the eye tears, nose is like pouring snot. And then almost with every attack with most people, they get into this like really agitated state where they start kind of like, it feels better to kind of move their body. And the best way it was explained to me is like if you slam your thumb into a car door and you want to shake that pain away, people do that with their whole bodies. And the reason I think this is super important and interesting is because if you are going to be doing that a couple times a day during attacks, you may not want to leave your house, right? Because you might be kind of mistaken for having a really serious mental health, even like a psychotic break. So it's a really isolating disorder in a way that migraine isn't, because it's really hard to explain to other people how something like a headache might make you really want to kill yourself and might make you behave in these rather odd ways.
Yeah, I had a friend whose father was a sufferer of clusters, and I recall before the laws improved here in Colorado substantially, I was providing mushrooms for a bit, and I couldn't not do it, knowing what I knew at that point about clusters. I'm like, okay, you're how old and you can't access mushrooms anymore? And he knew actually that it helped him. So he just like didn't, for whatever reason, take those steps to access it, which is wild to me.
Well, it's common because, as you know, people are scared. Psychedelics are really stigmatized, and a lot of people don't know how to access them. So, the other thing is, cluster headache is really, really hard to get. It takes like an average of 5 years to get a diagnosis. And if you can imagine, like having a pain that is so severe over and over and over again for that long, and continually going to the doctor, getting misdiagnosed with, sinus problems, getting your teeth pulled, and, just being told that you have all of these other issues, people think that maybe they're going nuts. I mean, it's really brutal. It's really brutal.
Yeah. So how did this whole, let's start with psychedelics broadly. Did psychedelics come across your radar as in like an interesting field of medical research first, or was it something along the lines of ClusterBusters, like specific kind of cluster interventions?
Well, I'm writing my first book. So my first book is called Not Tonight, and there wasn't much patient advocacy when I was writing my first book. But I knew that there was a group of people with cluster headache that were taking psychedelics. I kind of had this vague knowledge of that. And I knew that in 2006, there was a research article in the Journal of Neurology about psilocybin and LSD and cluster headache. I didn't know much about ClusterBusters. I just sort of had an awareness that this phenomenon was happening. As part of that research, I would go to this event called Headache on the Hill, which is a kind of annual political advocacy event where people with headache go and talk to their legislators. It was mostly at that time headache doctors, a pretty small group of headache doctors. I'm sorry to say they're not that interesting. Like, I mean, they're kind of like a boring group of people. And around 2012, Bob Wold, the founder and executive director of ClusterBusters, attended this meeting, and he brought a group of people in ClusterBusters with him. And one of the headache doctors kind of gave me a little elbow, and he was like, "That's the guy from ClusterBusters. They take drugs." And I was like, "Oh." Let me go meet them. And that thing is, they were so different. Like, they completely changed the vibe of the room. They're so much more fun. They were kind of laughing. They seemed like they liked each other. They were definitely the crowd of people I wanted to hang out with. And, yeah, so I went and I talked to them and I met them. And the next year, I was finishing up my book. The next year I had lunch with Bob Wold. I was super nervous to ask him about psychedelics. 2013 was a kind of different time. I'm in Washington, D.C. at this event, and I'm going to be like, "Hey, tell me about your drugs." But, he's much older than me. But he's awesome. You know Bob. And he was so excited to have an academic ask him questions. He was like, "Please come to our conference." And I was like, "Okay, maybe this will be an article." And I went there, and you should come to a ClusterBusters meeting. They are amazing. It is like a vibrant, energetic, exciting place where people are helping each other heal, and they do not care about the legal, about prohibition, because when you have a pain that's this severe, you're going to help other people survive. And I, at that time, needed that kind of story. I needed to see resistance. I was so tired of talking to doctors about how they couldn't do this important research because they didn't have funding, or the laws were against them, or the FDA had these rules. And here were these patients just doing the work. And I was like, "Yeah, this is great. Let's learn more about this." And so I was like, "Yeah, I'm going to write about this."
That's great. And I guess as long as there's been culture, there's been people breaking the law. Like, as long as we had law, right? And some people are doing it in really justifiable ways, and others not so much. But were there any like interesting historical precedents for something similar? Like, the medical, I don't know, like washing hands. Maybe washing hands was illegal before surgeries at a certain point. But like, I don't know. Like, are there any other like clever or interesting kind of analogies to this kind of scenario?
Well, you can go directly towards other patient advocacy groups, citizen science movements. A kind of direct, earlier precedent would be ACT UP and TAG in the HIV/AIDS movement. Those kind of buyers clubs. When people are desperate. They will do what they need to do to survive. And sociology, a kind of old theory for this is just strain theory. If people are hungry, they're going to steal that loaf of bread. That's simple as that. And then you can go back, the kind of self-help movements in the 60s were very similar. Women's health movements emerged from this realization that women couldn't trust their doctors to know what was best for them. And so they were going to create their own knowledge, and they were going to kind of start sharing that. And you get the Boston Women's Health Collective out of that. You get Jane's, I just forgot the word, but you get these movements where women are helping other women find abortions underground. And, when prohibition comes, people find a way to get treatment. So this is certainly not new, but it was nice to see this movement for pain. It was nice to see patients helping each other in this particular way. And it was a great way for me to be able to talk about the emergence of the psychedelic movement from a really completely different angle.
I love that. So was it at this meeting, the ClusterBusters conference, that you decided this is a book?
Well, writing a book is that's a big lift. It took a couple of years before I just decided I was going to write a book. I mean, that was 2013, and the book came out in 2024. So, I had a baby. I had some little kids. When I thought I was really good, just going to write an article about it, and I wrote up that article. I sent it to my writing group and my group of sociologists, and they read it. I think that was in 2016, and they said, "I'm sorry, this is going to be your next book. This is too big and too interesting." I mean, at the time, I had another project. I was going to start working on, pediatric asthma in the city, to be honest. And they were like, "Yeah, no, sorry." But, a lot of people in my field were like, "Why would you write about psychedelics?" Michael Pollan hadn't put out his book yet. And people thought it was a really strange idea to devote your time to psychedelia.
A guy has to do it first, right? Is that how it works?
Yeah. Well, not only did somebody have to do it first, but they had to, Michael Pollan really focused on NYU. He focused on the above ground. That's the story he wrote. He hints at an underground, but he doesn't talk much about the underground. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess it was kind of a little bit of an odd project to talk about this peculiar, niche group of pain patients who were doing the work for themselves.
Yeah, when did his book come out? Probably 2017-ish or so. Yeah, so that makes sense. Like 4 years in, and then that happens, and you're like, "Oh, wow." So were you staying in touch with ClusterBusters and Bob through the years there then, like, and kind of learning more?
Yeah, so I would go to every conference, and a lot of this book turned out to be history. So the internet is, in many ways, the book is a history of the internet and the role of the internet in the formation of the underground, particularly in the 1990s and the early noughts, right? So you have, that's when ClusterBusters starts to form, when people are sharing information, not just about drugs, but about their unusual disease, the diseases they have. And so that's when they start developing their psychedelic protocol and those old discussion group forums. So most of my work was really being done online, looking at, who was the first person to, patient zero, who was the first person to kind of like actually propose this idea, and how did that person convince anyone else who to take a psychedelic when they were experiencing excruciating pain? How did the movement grow? How did they get this work to a Harvard hospital? All of that stuff was really documented electronically in various forums and through email correspondence. And the more contemporary stuff I would keep up with, like as an ethnographer would, but it wasn't located. It wasn't like a street corner ethnography That's not how the underground meets anymore.
Right. I must be fascinating to have like been given access to so many emails and and lists and like work through your way through like other person's world in that way to like help build that. It's fascinating.
Well, yeah, you start to think you're living through their world, actually. And yeah, because yeah, in a kind of funny way, I particularly so the emails that I was given, and this was actually the researcher they worked with at Harvard was named John Halpern. He was a psychiatrist, and it was his idea. I went and I interviewed him, and he was like, you should get the email correspondence between me and Bob Wold and Rick Doblin. And he, it was a great idea, and
Yeah.
they all gave me permission. But the way I was able to access the emails was through Bob Wold. He was the only one who had the kind of whole archive. So if you think about how emails are treated and exchanged, I'm missing something, right? I'm only having emails that were sent to and from Bob. But I had his complete set because he is incredibly good at filing things. So, but I don't have any emails that say like Rick Doblin and John Halpern were, if they were emailing without, CCing Bob, I don't have that. If they picked up the phone and spoke to each other, I don't have that. But I was in a way, like being in, sociologists, what we, in a way, like, we're just like, we love gossip, like we love being a fly on the wall. And so it was like reading through their exchanges and kind of pulling together what was happening. It's a lot like being a fly on the wall. And I was kind of sometimes quite shocking, sometimes quite stressful. Sometimes I was like, no, don't do that. And then they do it. But you can't stop history.
Right. So the essence of this thing and what was interesting is people hurting so bad that they're willing to break federal laws to take care of themselves and others, and in many cases strangers that they may not even really know even over the internet, right? Maybe just one or two posts, and then like pioneers who kind of did the really scary initial work, ostensibly scary. I don't know.
I think that's quite right. First of all, it's interesting to think about people meeting online as strangers. One thing that was really fun for me is going back to those early internet days and seeing how much information people share in a way that you and I would no longer share online because we have a very different sensibility about what's private, what's personal, and what's private online. And also seeing about how people negotiate trust on the internet. So there was a lot of like, hey, what band do you listen to? And trying to kind of like form friendships and kind of like negotiate those relationships. But a lot of what formed that trust was a recognition that somebody else was experiencing this really incredibly awful pain that nobody in your immediate life understood. And one of the things that if you ever go to a ClusterBusters meeting, and I really do hope you come. I think they would love to have you, Joe. When somebody with cluster headache meets somebody else with cluster headache for the very first time, it's almost always the first time they've ever met anybody else with the disease. I really think it's like they're seeing themselves in the mirror for the first time. Like it's that powerful, and the connections people meet online are transformative, and they will really go to they will do what it takes to help each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it amazing. Like I loved this first person. The way you kind of spun up the story of the Scottish gentleman was like fascinating. And I was like, oh man, I need to go meet this guy too. But just really like a fascinating story of like one random contributor sharing a really far out story. And then people are like, I don't know. And some people seemed like they were willing to bite after not too much convincing. What do you have to lose? I think is part of it. But for me, like one of the things is like, oh, if I'm tripping and I'm in tons of pain, is it going to be way worse? That's like got to be a fear for some people, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was it wasn't that easy for his name's Flash. This guy who really decided that who figured out that mushrooms and LSD could prevent his cluster headache cycles from coming on. He wasn't the only guy in the 90s who had figured this out. So I've met other people who were involved in the psychedelic community in the 1990s, who knew other people with cluster headache who were using psychedelics to treat cluster. It was just something that people knew. I've also talked to headache doctors who had other patients during that time who told them that these drugs worked. So not everybody is like Flash and is like, oh, I have to share this information. There was something about him where he was like, and if you meet him, I mean, he's kind of an eccentric guy. He has a very strong moral compass. He's really, and you can think about the leaders, the kind of more famous leaders in the psychedelic world now. I think about Rick Doblin as somebody like this, somebody who has a really strong moral compass. He really believes in the power of MDMA and the power of what it can do for healing. And that is what he's going to share it, right? It takes a lot to believe in something that strongly, that you're going to kind of, have this kind of quixotic dream that nobody, to do something like that in 1986, like the way that Rick Doblin does. And Flash has something of that in him. He's an syndicalist, right? Like he believes in like gift exchange economies. He's a person who really thinks that you should be doing the right thing for other people. So when he realizes that he can treat this extraordinary pain with something that grows in the ground, he will do it. He's trying to find another way to share that information. And not everybody's built that way. I'm not sure I'm built that way. I'd be like, oh, maybe I'll tell my neighbor, but am I going to like go to the lengths he went to start a movement? I don't know. Anyway, so he really tries to convince people. And the internet is so helpful there, because the internet, back in the 90s and the early, there was this whole discussion, like, is the internet going to democratize knowledge? And there's a real argument for how it is an anti-democratic force. But I think in this story, you really see it as a kind of pro-democracy force, right? So he's able to access scientific knowledge from the 50s and 60s and bring that to this, to the cluster headache community online. And he's able to use that kind of information in a quite canny way to help people understand why this quite strange treatment might actually help. And then, when somebody tries it and it works, like, other people are like, huh, maybe I should try it. So it's slow, but.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. By the way, it's the first time somebody, not me, said anarcho-syndicalism on the show in over 500 episodes. So thank you. I love hearing that. And, it's interesting to hear somebody like, does he identify that way?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he runs a bar that he donated. It's a complicated donation situation, and I don't want to get it wrong, but the bar is run according to a 500-page manifesto that he drafted himself.
Whoa.
So, he's got his political commitments, which I think are relevant to, how he became this kind of, I think, somebody who should be understood as someone who's a really important historical figure in the psychedelic world. Totally.
Yeah. As a result of this, like, and how you pictured him in the book, I can't wait to meet him and learn more and see what I can do there. And, there's something here about like you kind of mentioned doctors not being able to sort it out, but it's like, there's no political will to help people with orphan conditions, like really small population sets. Like, there's no political will for it. So it has to breed distrust in medicine, has to breed distrust in politics. And then like people just, okay, like, let me go out on the fringes and try some weird stuff, and hopefully I can get some help, even if it's super illegal.
Yeah. He's, slightly missed that question. Were we not
no
talking
question.
about neurodivergence?
Yeah, so like, no real question there, but it's just this idea of like, there's such like, in this condition, ClusterBusters. There's no hope. Like you
Oh,
spend 6 months
right.
with a
The kind of
doctor
yeah, the
and they
lack of
can't fix
political
it. What do
will.
you do? Lack of political will and like erosion of political trust and medical trust. Like that's a big deal. And people should be paying attention to that.
Yeah, thank you so much for reminding
Yeah,
that.
no worries.
I still, it's summer, so I still have, children in the house. So I have, so a lot of that is how I get into the story. For my first book is like why is there a lack of political will for the most painful, and I don't love to call things the most painful disease, to play the pain Olympics, but like this is a really serious disease that gets almost no federal funding. And what's going on there? So there are a couple of things going on. First of all, it's a headache. And headache gets very, very little attention, it's so highly stigmatized, and that stigmatized is institutionalized into like, things like federal resources. I also discovered, and after studying this, headache medicine for so long, I can't believe it took me so long to figure this out. Cluster headache's super hard to study using randomized controlled trials. It's just like inherently a random disease. People might only get it for a few weeks and then it goes into remission. That's a very hard disease to, study an intervention in if you're not quite sure when people are going to go into their cycle and when it's going to naturally end. And it also it doesn't quite qualify as an orphan disease. So it doesn't quite qualify for incentives for drug developers to actually make medicines for it. And so cluster headache just doesn't. Man, it is screwed in every possible way. It's really hard to imagine many other diseases where there's a kind of the structural forces create so much ignorance around this disease. Patients they experience every kind of barrier to care. So again, like, when you have people who are who are sick and the treatment is something that they can actually access, and there is like kind of, a technological way for people to communicate with each other, then you're starting to get the conditions where people can actually have a DIY medicine movement, right? That's like, that's not going to happen all the time with all different kinds of disorders, but that cluster headache, this is like, it's perfectly understandable why people would go to these lengths.
So I want to highlight like the kind of like disheartening aspect of like not being able to trust doctors. There's one story in the book, and stop me if this is too much of a spoiler, but like the physician was pretty much at wit's end and said, the only way to fix this is to like kill yourself. And like that's, I don't know if he said it explicitly, but that's fucking dark. And I've encountered some not so great physicians myself as a patient, and like I could kind of like relate to that. I probably suffered with chronic pain for about 12 to 15 years, and I couldn't get help. So I kind of could relate a little bit, but the doctors weren't telling me to just go for it in that way. But how do you like to think about that?
I've gone to a lot of these meetings with people with cluster headache, and in ethnography, one of the things, we're somewhere between a social science and a humanity. So one of the ways we talk about when do we know our research is done is through this idea of saturation. Like, you've heard so many stories, it's getting repetitive. You're like, oh, there's no more to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Every single time I am around people with cluster headache, I hear a worse story that I thought medicine could never get worse than than everything I just like. There's no bottom to how awful things are. And I've been here. I've experienced, like you, like I've been in pain a long time. When I heard that story, when somebody said in a meeting that a doctor had told them they were out of options and the last possible thing they could do was to shoot themselves. That's what they said, to shoot themselves. And this is a disease with a high attempted suicide rate and very likely a high, suicide rate. I mean, I just like, it was like being punched in the gut. Like, I mean, I was just like, I mean, it was just so upsetting. And then after that meeting broke, we're all having coffee. Somebody else says, "Oh yeah, that happened to me." Same story with a gun. Like I couldn't believe it. Like, but I'll go. They're having another meeting in September, and I feel fairly sure I'm going to hear an even worse story. It's like the one constant. And I just don't know how it's possible. I think doctors go into their profession because they want to heal people. I do. I really do. It's just so awful. Like, it's so bad. And but these are really healing spaces. I don't want to just like leave this really bleak. It's really healing for people to be able to go into these meetings and to be able to actually tell people who understand what it's been like.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of my orientation with a lot of this psychedelic stuff, is it's perhaps not even necessarily about the psychedelics, but it's more about these like connections where you can actually relate to people in a really deep way and be seen in a way that you haven't really been seen elsewhere. And psychedelics can help with that for sure, but it's not necessarily the primary thing that's the most helpful. Could be. We'll find out later. But, it's a really interesting thing.
Well, I think one of the errors people make about cluster headache. So cluster headache, it's a lower dose of psychedelics that people take, and there's a protocol. Taking this lower dose 3 times over a course of 10 or 11 days, like 5 days apart, and there's no therapy involved. But I do think that there is this social component. Biomedicine is reductionist, and we tend to ignore how important those social connections are. If you go to a ClusterBusters meeting, there's a whole lot of people there who never try what they call using a psychedelic is busting. They never bust. They're using just regular pharmaceuticals, and it's working for them. But I think that the healing is the network. The healing is, of course, the medicines help, right? But you can't look at one without the other. I think it's a real mistake. Pain is so isolating, and when you lose hope, like that's where like things become really devastating and dark. And one thing I've known in my own kind of career as a pain patient is you have to hold out that there's always going to be, you have to hold out hope there's going to be something for you. Psychedelics don't work for everyone, not for any diagnosis. And you have to be able to hope that something else will. Or that's it. If you don't have that. And that's where I think this like community connection is so vital and so important.
Yeah, and further, some people can't even get high off psychedelics, which is wild to me too. But it's fascinating. So, I have a tangential question, and then we can circle back.
I love the tangents.
So, you said medicine a moment ago, and that kind of like triggered this debate between drugs versus medicine and what these terms mean, and like the cultural aspects to it. And as an ethnographer, you might have an interesting perspective here of like this drugs versus medicine, like terminology. Like how do you like to see those two different terms, and like what kind of baggage have you seen between this like particular debate?
So you're thinking about medicine as like a pharmaceutical, like a drug versus a pharmaceutical, or medicine
Not
as a
necessarily,
practice?
no. Just how you use the term. I would say like less practice, more substance. So like
Trying to like wrap my head around
drugs.
it. Because
Exactly.
these
It's
words,
such a weird debate. It's like
these
it's
words
super
have
semantic, so stigmatized.
this is like what I live for. But
Yeah.
so I'm trying to kind of, medicine gets used in so many different ways. It has so many different meanings. So sometimes we use medicine to talk about a pill. Sometimes we talk about medicine to talk about an entire system of care. And sometimes, we use, when we talk about drug, we can be talking about a pharmaceutical, but sometimes we're using it to kind of distinguish medicine from something that's illicit, right? Um, so I can't remember exactly what I said that kind of triggered you to say this. I think we can talk a little bit about how our healthcare system has become much more reliant on pharmaceuticals, like how it's become more pharmaceuticalized, and there's been a lot less care in those systems, and what it means when we start distinguishing drugs from pharmaceuticals, right? And like how doctors have started, biomedicine has started to infiltrate what we consider medical care and what's problematic about that. I think there's different ways that we can kind of like start to disentangle those terms. We can talk about whether or not what's happening in ClusterBusters is medicine. I think it is. Or can medicine only happen in controlled settings? I don't think it necessarily, I mean, the whole idea of like what's a controlled medical setting, a controlled setting is, that's my, I, that's something I have a lot to say about. But I think that, I think that those are really interesting terms that we use in these really loose ways and that are infused with a lot of moral meaning.
Right. And like I see it in the psychedelic space where some people hate the term psychedelic and they only
Mm-hmm.
want to say the term plant medicine. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm specifically having a conversation about MDMA or LSD and they're like, "Yeah, plant medicine's totally." And I'm like, "Whoa." And then very similar people will be really anti-pharma generally. Like kind of like the worst thing you could ever do is take antibiotics or even Tums, you know? Like what's going on here? It's
Well, so
fascinating.
yeah, so the thing that I love about my field, the reason why I'm in it is because I really like politics, and I like politics with like a small p, right? So all of those orientations are really to me political orientations. Like you're talking about your values, your morals, what you think those words mean, and d- the idea of like an entheogen versus a psychedelic versus a hallucinogen, and what those distinctions are, and what impact do we think our words have, and how they matter. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah. And I take the position of like kind of learning from the gay rights movement where we just have to like say the words, say the dirty stigmatized words to try to rehabilitate those stigmatized words. So I say psychedelic. I don't say entheogen and tactogen, any of these things that are like skirting around the real topic to try to trick somebody into thinking you're talking about something new as opposed to something old. It's like a
Well,
mhm.
the other thing is that entheogen kind of infuses the conversation around psychospiritual discourse, and that's for the patient population that I'm studying. That's not helpful. Clusterbusters is not psychospiritual, not at all. There's nothing
Their
about it.
orientation is so radically different from mine. It's fascinating. I've been working with them for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so interesting how different their orientation around this stuff is from me. But I'm like, absolutely willing to work with them on that. It's like this, you guys are doing this to survive. Like, fuck yeah, go for it. But it's like, I try to talk about psychology in any way. And it's like, no, like, because there's
Well,
certain
psychology
conversations that
is
can devalue their thing, and
psychology
delegitimize
is
their
a.
thing.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over
No,
you.
that's enough.
Psychology is it has a really troubled past in headache medicine. So in the 1970s, there was a really, really the whole mid 20th century, such an emphasis on psychosomatic theories around what caused headache disorders. And in cluster headache, that manifested itself in this kind of like physiological and psychological profile of who gets cluster headache. This was actually the thing that initially caught my attention about cluster headache back in 2001. It was like the first thing that I noticed at my very first, medical conference around headache. I thought I was going to go and find, all these headache doctors saying terrible sexist things about migraine, but I went and I learned about this disease called cluster headache, and it was like this prominent headache specialist telling me that there was a disease called about that only affected white men, although they had like kind of like orangey, leathery skin, they had faces that looked like lions, and they were also like masculine in orientation. They had really muscular bodies. They smoked a lot. They drank a lot. They took a lot of risks, and there was something about that was causative of this disease, cluster headache. And even in 2001, I was like, am I like in some weird phrenology conference? Is this like the 19th century? Like, there's no way that any disease has a profile like this. This is the weirdest thing I've ever heard. So I immediately did a research project on like the history of this bizarre idea, and there was like no good evidence of it. And it all came down to this psychosomatic and like the very real kind of psychosomatic movement, was generating these profiles of people with various diseases. Migraine was a model psychosomatic disease. And because migraine was, well, why not come up with a profile for people with cluster headache? But with cluster headache, it really stuck. And even today, I run into the cluster headache profile all the time. So if you start talking about psychology in a headache, with a group of people with headache, I mean, they're going to be like, shut up. Like, I mean, it is so, people think it's so stigmatizing. They have not gotten over, when I first my parents took me to a pediatrician when I was 5 for headaches, and I was diagnosed with a type A personality, right? Like this whole migraine personality. It is like, no, so you're not going to hear any of that. And you're certainly not going to get into this like whole spiritual discourse. It's a completely different ballgame.
Right. And circling back to entheogen, I just think it's not a super helpful thing to talk to all people about this further than ClusterBusters types and headache disorder people. Like, it's just not a helpful thing necessarily to infuse like explicit spiritual terminology. But like psyche, like quite a fucking spiritual term. It's people just don't really kind of get the origins of it. But anyway, that's how I use it. Psyche, I say it often and I mean it kind of like in a bigger way. But it's I'm not trying to like beat around the bush really. So yeah, like I thank you for that on the issues with the headache community and psychology, and I agree. Like they get deflated. Like in your book does a really good job of showing like how people just get shot down regularly by physicians when they have headache disorders. Oh, you're just drug seeking, blah blah blah. You're making it up. You just don't want to be in school.
Yeah. Well, I think the psychedelic and pain research has the possibility of perhaps bringing some of that mind-body connection back into the treatment of headache disorders. I would love to see that. Like, I think there's a real risk, there's a real problem of going back into these like somatic, like really strongly somatic explanations. But, history matters. And I think ultimately the reason why we don't hear more about cluster headache, the reason why we don't hear more about psychedelic use for migraine is because it doesn't fit very well into this broader psychospiritual movement that is driving so much of the psychedelic, space.
I don't know if I told you this story yet. I was at a psychedelic retreat in Jamaica working as the Michael Pollan book was coming out, so 2017. It was an interesting time. There was I think a 15-year-old boy there to do mushrooms. Brought both parents, convinced both parents, very smart kid, that, hey, I want to go to this retreat. American Midwest, right? Like he convinced somehow his parents that he could leave school midday to go home and smoke cannabis and then go back to school because that was one thing that could help with the symptoms. He didn't find anything else. And then started doing mushrooms, but started at a retreat where it was legal with his parents and found great relief. And I found that fascinating that even a 15-year-old was able to pull that off. And it just kind of like shows how broad in scope this project really is, particularly. And I think he's in like amazing levels of remission now, this many years later.
When your kid is in pain, when your kid is suffering, you will do a lot to treat them. I mean, it's I'm a parent. I can't.
I feel that way
It,
about my dog, but I can't imagine if it was a kid.
I cannot imagine my dog on psychedelics. I mean, she's pretty. But
Yeah.
look, no, I mean, yeah, you can't. It is very hard to see your kid suffering, and I've seen, I've had friends who were about as straight as an arrow, talk to me about, remarkable transformations, that their children have gone through ketamine treatment, when they were, severely mentally ill, in a completely different context, and they never thought that they would do this. But when your kid is suffering, you're willing to consider a lot. And I think actually, that's it, what's so powerful. But I mean, this it drove cannabis reform. That's how powerful this is.
Have you seen evidence of minors being involved in CB?
I've seen a lot of I've seen parents will come. Um, First of all, I want to just make clear, ClusterBusters is more than a psychedelic organization, so it's a really great resource to learn about oxygen therapy, which is a very safe and effective abortive treatment. To learn about pharmaceutical treatments.
But you have to get
I
the
know
instructions from ClusterBusters for it to work right.
you
It
do,
sounds like
yeah,
to
because your
me.
doctor won't teach. Doctors don't know how to
Right.
prescribe oxygen. Yeah, I talk a lot about oxygen treatment in my book because um, it's so, here you have this like safe, inexpensive, uh, should be easy to access treatment, and you need cluster busters to get it, right? And so, like, if you can't get and well, let me put a pin in that. So I just want to say that, like, families will go there. I don't know what they're using as treatment. But I do know there is one cluster head. People like to call themselves cluster head. This particular cluster head does. Whose mom, when he started getting cluster headaches when he was 12, his mom found cluster busters and I think helped him get treatment when he was about 17. So yes, I do know what happens. Um, and I do know that there are families there. I don't think that cluster busters uh, doesn't distribute, doesn't, they're not, but it is, they do believe that people are getting cluster headache when in pediatric populations are being underdiagnosed. They're an incredible resource for information. And so, yeah.
And worth noting, they've been able to maintain a nonprofit status for quite a long time with the federal government doing this kind of work, which I find spectacular. It shows or indicates just how seriously they're taking it and how well they're able to organize to be able to maintain that status. And that, in some ways we can, believe in America a little bit because, in other countries, imagine doing this in like Russia or China, right? Like that's not really going to fly. This kind of work, especially like if you were starting from scratch, like it's pretty impressive that it's been allowed to stand for so long. I love that.
Yeah, well, there is a huge number of, especially in rare disease communities, of patients doing this kind of work, um, bringing their data to university researchers, and making the work happen. A great deal of what we know about cluster headache is because patients brought their knowledge, brought their data, um, brought volunteers to university researchers. So I just want to point out that I think one of my main concerns here, and I think this is actually a broader concern across psychedelic research, is how this community-based research occurs with universities. A lot of psychedelic research, not just in clusterbusters, but across psychedelia, involves underground communities, involves naturalistic research, involves people who are really excited about psychedelic use for one reason or another. And there are and there's an ethics involved there. When the above ground, when researchers in universities partner with community organizations or scrape, the internet for information, there are ethical obligations there, and there's always a way that there can be ethical breaches as well. And I think that we haven't talked about that enough in the psychedelic world, that there hasn't been enough of an exploration of that. A lot of the knowledge that's being patented, a lot of the knowledge that is being, studied right now is knowledge that, it's not new. It's it's not, it's a lot of it comes from Indigenous people, and a lot of it comes from the underground.
Let's talk about that. So this kind of like IP grabbing, kind of like trying to lock everything down. It does seem really problematic. And the tragic thing is, is this going to hold up in court? And I think some of it won't. But they have this, what do they call it? Like hatch and thicket approach, where it's just so tangled up, where it might just be endless to try to get out of that. Have you seen any kind of weird or interesting cases around that yet, or other ethical breaches that you might want to mention, or potential problems that you might want to mention?
I think the best resource for this is really Porta Sophia out of the University of Wisconsin, where they are looking for bad patents. And yes, patents are being written really broadly, sometimes just to prevent other companies from pursuing research in an area. And Porta Sophia is really a group of historians who are creating a database of prior art, right? And a lot of which is just stuff from the underground, right? Like stuff from Reddit, stuff from places where psychonauts are collecting their information, to make it easier for the patent officers to investigate patent applications, right? And to see if the information that is, if a patent application is really presenting something that is novel and original, because it can be quite hard, of course, to find prior art just on Reddit. You know what I mean? Well, I don't think it's that hard, but maybe a patent officer does. And so, so that's a kind of strategy that's being used now. I don't want to get too deep into a patent discussion where I'm going to get into a lot of legal conversation, because I will absolutely get it wrong. Every time I talk to a lawyer, they're so precise with their language, and I am not.
Yeah, not lawyers here.
But I do think that there should be more. We should talk more about guidelines that researchers should be following when they ask people in the underground to participate as volunteers or to give up their information to them. And because I think there are kind of different levels of risk and vulnerability in asking communities to engage in in the use of illicit drugs, and then to hand over their data to people in universities who are then transforming that knowledge into things that they can, profit off of. And there's lots of information out there on how to ethically engage with community-based research, and we should be talking about that and thinking about that in the psychedelic world.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah, and I think it's coming. It's coming slower than we probably need, but it'll hopefully develop. Cool. So I think let's work towards wrapping here. So let's talk about your book a little bit more, and what did we miss in this conversation that you might want to mention about the book?
Well, let's see. Well, the reason I bring up those potential abuses with the underground is because I think that ClusterBusters has produced a lot of the knowledge that is so useful for that academics are producing in the psychedelic world. and they haven't always gotten the credit that they deserve. So I think that they're kind of a model for how exploitation can happen, um, and which is what got me thinking about this. So I would like to kind of add that. I also think that there are great ways, when you talk about the government, that things can be done in this U.S. government. Like, we can be really distrustful of the U.S. government for lots of reasons. Uh, but there are models for getting difficult research done. Um, so let's see, how was I thinking about this? Um, it may be possible for the FDA to agree to a set of rules for developing a medication that don't require a randomized control trial, for example. That can happen, but you need to have, a set of, you need to have the right experts helping you navigate the FDA and so forth. So, I guess I one of the things that I learned in researching this book is that we need to help these kind of communities kind of get the resources they need to develop what are really important vital medications. And right now, ClusterBusters in particular doesn't have those resources, but they're sitting on a life-saving treatment. And they've been doing the work for a long time. And boy, that treatment would save a lot of lives.
Yeah, for sure. All right. And what is the name of your book again? And where can people find it?
Psychedelic Outlaws, the Movement Revolutionizing Modern Medicine. And you can find it, in any store that you shop on online. And hopefully you can order it from your local bookshop as well. I mean, that would be preferable. You can also play the audiobook. Apparently it's available on Spotify. So,
oh, cool.
Go to town. I would skip the very long timeline that poor woman had to read. But yeah.
Brilliant. And are you doing any kind of public events in the near future?
Yeah. So I should be posting them on my website, which is joannakempner.com. I'll be at Psychedelic, and I think I'll be at a bunch of different places. I can't remember them all off the top of my head. ClusterBusters has a whole series of really great forums around, like book clubs around. They did a 4-part book club for my book that is on their YouTube station as well. And I encourage people to watch that, hopefully alongside reading my book, because a lot of the people featured in my book are on that channel.
Brilliant. Professor Kempner, thank you so much for this, and I look forward to seeing you at Penn at Philadelphia.
Well, thank you for having me.